At 11:23 a.m., August 13, 1945, First Lieutenant Oscar Perdomo rolled his P-47 Thunderbolt into a hard left bank over the mountains of Korea. 8,000 feet below him, 5 Japanese fighters broke formation. Perdomo watched them carefully. He was 26 years old. He had flown 9 combat missions, and he had 0 victories. The son of a Mexican immigrant who had once ridden with Pancho Villa, he had grown up in East Los Angeles listening to stories of revolution and survival. Now, thousands of miles from home, he was about to write a story of his own. What happened in the next 4 minutes would enter aviation history. Above Korea that morning, the sky had turned into chaos. More than 50 Japanese aircraft had scrambled to intercept 38 American P-47 Thunderbolts approaching the Seoul area. The Americans were outnumbered. They were also 750 miles from their base, flying a mission so long that a mechanical failure anywhere over the ocean would almost certainly mean death. None of the pilots knew something extraordinary. The war was already ending. In Japan, Emperor Hirohito was meeting with his war council, discussing surrender after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the news had not yet reached the pilots fighting over Korea. For them, the war was still very real. And Oscar Perdomo was already diving toward the enemy. His Thunderbolt carried a name painted across the nose: Lil Me's Meat Chopper. The artwork showed a diaper-wearing baby chewing a cigar, wearing a derby hat, and holding a rifle. The baby represented Perdomo's infant son, Kenneth, waiting back home in Los Angeles. Oscar had never met the boy. When he left for war, Kenneth had only just been born. Every mission raised the same question: would he ever see his son? The mission itself was enormous. 8 hours in the air, nearly 1,500 miles round trip. Most of it flown over open ocean where rescue was almost impossible. Fortunately, the P-47 Thunderbolt had been designed exactly for this kind of mission. Republic Aviation had modified the aircraft specifically for long-range operations in the Pacific. Engineers extended the wings and installed wet wing fuel tanks, adding nearly 100 gallons of fuel inside each wing. With external tanks attached, the aircraft could carry more than 1,200 gallons of fuel. That range allowed Thunderbolts to escort B-29 superfortresses deep into enemy territory and still make the long journey home. But range alone did not make the Thunderbolt dangerous. What made it deadly was its firepower. 8 50 caliber Browning machine guns, more than 3,000 rounds of ammunition, and a 2,800 horsepower Pratt and Whitney radial engine capable of pushing the 7-ton fighter beyond 460 miles per hour. If a Thunderbolt pilot caught an enemy aircraft in his gun sight, the result was usually decisive. But finding the enemy had proven difficult. For weeks, the 507th Fighter Group had flown mission after mission from their base on Ie Shima, a small island near Okinawa. Most missions ended in disappointment. They escorted bombers. They strafed abandoned airfields. They flew hundreds of miles without ever seeing a single Japanese fighter. Many pilots joked that the enemy had simply run out of airplanes. On August 13th, that illusion ended. The mission had begun at dawn. 53 Thunderbolts lifted off from Ie Shima and turned northwest toward Korea. Along the way, 15 aircraft turned back with mechanical issues or navigation problems. That left 38 Thunderbolts continuing the mission. For hours they droned across the East China Sea, the ocean stretching endlessly beneath them. Finally, they crossed the Korean coast near Seoul. That was when radar operators reported something unexpected. Enemy contacts. Lots of them. The Japanese had thrown everything they had into the air. Pilots from the 22nd and 85th Sentai scrambled their aircraft to intercept the Americans. Their fighters included Nakajima Ki 84 Frank interceptors and older Ki 43 Oscar fighters. Even a pair of obsolete Yokosuka K-5Y Willow training biplanes somehow ended up in the sky. Within minutes, dozens of aircraft were weaving through the same patch of airspace. Dogfights erupted across the sky. Smoke trails marked falling airplanes. Parachutes blossomed far below. And somewhere in the chaos, Oscar Perdomo picked his target. He chose 3 trailing fighters at the back of the Japanese formation. It was a classic tactic. Attack the rear aircraft first. If done correctly, the lead pilots might not even realize they were under attack until their wingmen began exploding. Perdomo pushed the throttle forward. The Thunderbolt surged ahead. The distance closed rapidly. 2,000 yards. 1,500. 1,000. At 800 yards, he lined up the gun sight. Then he squeezed the trigger. 8 machine guns roared simultaneously. The war was about to end. Oscar Perdomo did not know it. What he did know was that for the first time in 9 missions, he had finally found the enemy. And he discovered something about himself. He was very good at killing airplanes. The first burst struck the key, 84 franc exactly where he aimed. Bullets ripped through the engine cowling and cockpit. Black smoke poured from the aircraft. Seconds later, the fighter rolled into a spiral dive toward the Korean countryside far below. Perdomo did not watch it fall. He had already moved to his second target. The Ki 84 was Japan's best fighter late in the war. Fast, well-armed, capable of challenging American aircraft in the hands of experienced pilots. But even the best fighter had weaknesses. The Thunderbolt could not outturn a Japanese aircraft. It could not outclimb one either. But it had something else. Speed. When diving from above, a P-47 could accelerate faster than almost anything else in the sky. In aerial combat, the formula was simple. Speed plus surprise plus firepower equals destruction. Perdomo fired again. His bullets tore across the second fighter. Pieces of metal broke away. Then flames erupted from the fuel tank. The aircraft exploded into a spinning fireball. 2 kills. Less than 60 seconds. The third Japanese pilot had seen enough. He rolled inverted and dove away toward the ground. Perdomo considered chasing him, but pursuit would mean losing sight of the larger battle. Somewhere above him, 37 other American pilots were still fighting dozens of Japanese aircraft. He needed to rejoin his squadron. Perdomo pulled the Thunderbolt into a climbing turn. The sky was filled with twisting aircraft and drifting smoke trails. At least 3 parachutes floated below. He could not tell whether they belonged to American or Japanese pilots. Then something strange caught his eye. 2 aircraft flying together far below the battle. They looked wrong. Too small. Too slow. Perdomo blinked in disbelief. They were training biplanes. 2 Yokosuka K-5Y Willow trainers. Canvas-covered relics that had no business being in the middle of a modern air battle. Why they were there made no tactical sense. But they carried Japanese markings, which made them legitimate targets. Perdomo rolled the Thunderbolt upside down and dove. The biplanes saw him coming. They separated instantly, each pilot trying to escape. Perdomo chose the closer aircraft. The Willow's maximum speed was barely 130 miles per hour. The Thunderbolt was diving at more than 400. The fight lasted 3 seconds. Machine gun fire shredded the biplane. It burst into flames and spiraled toward the ground. Perdomo's third victory. He searched for the second trainer, but could not find it. The pilot had vanished into the clouds or blended into the terrain below. Perdomo pulled back into a climb and checked his ammunition counters. 3 victories had already consumed a huge portion of his rounds. The meat chopper still had teeth, but fewer than before. He climbed through the clouds again and flew directly into an ambush. For Ki 84 fighters waited above him. They had positioned themselves perfectly. Sun behind them. Altitude advantage. Speed building in the dive. It was the classic fighter ambush. Hundreds of Allied pilots had died exactly this way. Perdomo saw them at the last possible moment. 4 dark shapes diving out of the glare. He had 2 seconds to react. 2 seconds to decide whether he would live, or whether his son Kenneth would grow up without ever knowing his father. And Oscar Perdomo made a decision that shocked even the Japanese pilots diving toward him. He didn't run. The P-47 Thunderbolt could absorb enormous punishment. But even a Thunderbolt could not survive 4 fighters firing at once. Oscar Perdomo understood that instantly. So he did something that violated every instinct a fighter pilot possessed. Instead of diving away, he turned directly into the attack. The maneuver shocked the Japanese formation. They had expected the American to brake or run for altitude. Instead, the heavy Thunderbolt was climbing toward them, nose high, its speed bleeding away as it rose to meet the diving fighters. For a fraction of a second, all 4 Japanese pilots had to adjust their aim. That hesitation was enough. Perdomo rolled the Thunderbolt onto its back and yanked the controls hard, reversing direction in a brutal maneuver. The Japanese fighters overshot. Their diving speed carried them straight past the American aircraft. In an instant, the geometry of the fight had changed. The The hunters had become targets. Perdomo selected the last aircraft in the formation. His gun sight settled on the P-47. He fired. 8 .50 caliber machine guns thundered together. The Japanese pilot never saw the tracers. Bullets smashed through the engine cowling. The aircraft exploded in a burst of orange flame. For kills. In less than 5 minutes of combat, Oscar Perdomo had just become an ace. Not over months of fighting, not across dozens of missions, but in a single engagement over Korea. The remaining Japanese fighters scattered. One dove toward the ground. Another climbed into the clouds. The third tried to circle back for another attack. Perdomo ignored them all. He checked his ammunition counters. The numbers were alarming. He had only seconds of ammunition left, perhaps 30 seconds of firing time, and he was still 750 miles from home. He needed to find his squadron and start the long flight back to base. The sky above Korea had turned into complete chaos. Smoke columns marked crash sites across the countryside. Aircraft twisted and maneuvered at every altitude. Some were still fighting. Others were simply trying to survive. Perdomo finally spotted two familiar shapes at about 3,000 feet. Thunderbolts. The large paddle blade propellers flashing in the sunlight made them unmistakable. Friendlies. He banked toward them. Then he saw what they were fighting. A single P-84 Frank had locked onto the tail of one Thunderbolt. The American pilot was weaving violently, trying to shake the attacker. But the Japanese fighter stayed with him. The second Thunderbolt tried to help. But every time the wingman lined up a shot, the two aircraft crossed into each other's firing line. The geometry was impossible. The American pilot being chased was seconds from death. Perdomo pushed his throttle forward. The Thunderbolt surged into a dive. His ammunition counters showed perhaps 20 seconds of firing time remaining. That would have to be enough. He approached from above and behind. The same attack profile that had already destroyed 4 enemy fighters. The Japanese pilot never noticed him. He was focused entirely on the Thunderbolt in his gun sight, waiting, timing the perfect moment to fire. He never checked his rear. Perdomo opened fire. Tracers stretched across the sky. The bullets struck the P-84's fuselage and engine. The aircraft shuddered. Smoke poured from the damaged engine. Then suddenly, the gun stopped. Not gradually. Not with a few final shots. Complete silence. All 8 machine guns had run dry at the same moment. 3,000 rounds of ammunition. Gone in less than 6 minutes of combat. The Japanese fighter was damaged, but still flying. Smoke streamed from the engine. The pilot realized he was under attack from a new direction. He broke away from the Thunderbolt he had been chasing and turned toward Perdomo. Now the situation had changed completely. Oscar Perdomo was alone. He was 750 miles from base. He faced an enemy fighter that still had guns. And he had none. Most pilots would have run. The mathematics demanded it. Dive for the deck. Use the Thunderbolt's speed. Escape. Return home. Fight another day. Perdomo did not run. The P-84 stabilized and pointed its nose directly at him. The Japanese pilot could see the distinctive checkered nose of the 507th Fighter Group. From his perspective, he faced another armed American fighter. He had no idea that the Thunderbolt's guns were empty. Perdomo watched the enemy line up his attack. Smoke still streamed from the P-84's damaged engine. But the aircraft remained deadly. The next 60 seconds would be decided by nerve. Perdomo pushed the Thunderbolt straight toward the enemy fighter. It was a maneuver that made absolutely no tactical sense. An unarmed aircraft charging an armed opponent. But Perdomo understood something the enemy pilot did not. The Japanese pilot believed the Thunderbolt still had ammunition. All he saw was an American fighter charging directly at him at a combined closing speed approaching 800 miles per hour. It was aerial chicken, one of the most dangerous games in combat aviation. The Japanese pilot flinched first. With smoke trailing behind him and an apparently armed American fighter racing toward him, he broke sharply to the right. Perdomo followed, turning inside the P-84, maintaining the illusion of attack. Every second the enemy pilot stayed defensive was another second of survival. Perdomo keyed his radio. Enemy fighter engaged. Need assistance. Somewhere above the battlefield, another Thunderbolt pilot heard the call. The response was immediate. Perdomo continued the dangerous dance. Turn, counter-turn, dive, climb. Again and again he pointed the empty guns of the Thunderbolt at the Japanese fighter. Again and again the P-84 pilot reacted defensively, But the bluff could not last forever. Eventually, the enemy pilot would realize something was wrong. Eventually, he would notice that no tracers were coming. Eventually, he would understand. Help arrived first. A second Thunderbolt dropped from the clouds at full power. The pilot had seen the fight and positioned himself perfectly. The Japanese fighter never saw the new threat. 8 machine guns opened fire. The Ki-84 disintegrated instantly. Wings tore away. The engines separated from the fuselage. Burning debris scattered across the sky. 5 victories. Oscar Perdomo had just achieved something fewer than 100 American pilots accomplished during the entire war. He had become an ace in a single day, the last American pilot ever to do so. But the mission was far from over. He was still 750 miles from home. His fuel gauges showed numbers that demanded immediate attention, and the sky above Korea still held enemy aircraft. The morning's battle was finished. The long flight home was about to begin. The Thunderbolts turned south for the long journey home. They climbed to 12,000 feet, a careful compromise. High enough that a pilot might glide toward land if his engine failed, but low enough to conserve the precious fuel that remained in their tanks. The radios were quiet. No one had the energy for conversation. Pilots watched their instruments, checked their fuel gauges again and again, and counted the minutes until IE Shima appeared on the horizon. Below them stretched the endless blue-gray expanse of the East China Sea. The August heat rising from the water created violent thermals that rocked the heavy fighters without warning. Perdomo trimmed the Thunderbolt carefully, adjusting throttle and fuel mixture to squeeze every possible mile from the aircraft's remaining fuel. The P-47's autopilot held the course while he rested his hands. Only then did the reality of the morning begin to settle in. 5 victories. In a single fight. For 6 weeks, he had flown missions without seeing a single enemy fighter. Now, in less than 6 minutes of combat, everything had changed. He could still see the tracers streaking from his guns. Still see the Japanese fighters catching fire. Still feel the Thunderbolt shudder as thousands of rounds poured from its wings. The gun camera would record everything. Film did not lie. When they landed, intelligence officers would examine the footage frame by frame. Each burst of gunfire would be matched with each aircraft destroyed. The process sometimes took days. Until then, Perdomo's victories were simply claims. Every fighter pilot made them. Not every pilot could prove them. 2 hours into the flight home, a dark smudge appeared on the southern horizon. Okinawa. Beyond it lay IE Shima, a small island of coral and sand that had become home to thousands of American pilots and mechanics. The island carried its own scars. For months earlier, the famous war correspondent Ernie Pyle had been killed there by a Japanese machine gun during the invasion. His grave marker stood near the beach where Marines had stormed ashore. Now the same island served as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, launching missions against Japan day after day. Perdomo checked his gauges again. The needles hovered dangerously close to empty. Another 50 miles of flying would likely have meant dead engines and pilots ditching in the ocean. They had made it back just in time. One by one, the Thunderbolts entered the landing pattern. Landing gear down. Flaps extended. Final approach over the beach. Perdomo eased the heavy fighter onto the coral runway and felt the wheels finally touch the ground. 8 hours and 18 minutes after takeoff. Mission 507-35 was complete. He taxied toward the hard stand where his crew chief waited. The mechanic's eyes went immediately to the gun ports. Black carbon stains marked the wings, a sure sign that the guns had been fired. A lot. Then he looked at Perdomo's expression and realized something extraordinary had happened. The debriefing room filled quickly. Pilots still wearing their flight suits crowded around folding tables while intelligence officers moved from man to man taking notes. 20 Japanese aircraft destroyed. The number seemed almost unbelievable. But 38 American pilots had witnessed the battle. Their stories matched. Perdomo sat quietly and described his own fight. 5 aircraft. For fighters. 1 training biplane. The intelligence officer wrote everything down without comment. Initial claims would be filed immediately. Final confirmation would come later when the gun camera footage was reviewed. The 507th Fighter Group had entered combat only 6 weeks earlier. For most of that time, they had faced little opposition. Japanese commanders had been conserving aircraft, preparing for the massive invasion of the home islands that everyone believed was coming. August 13th had changed that. The Thunderbolts had stumbled into the largest concentration of Japanese fighters they would ever see. The result was astonishing. 20 enemy aircraft destroyed. 0 American losses. The kind of victory commanders dreamed about. The kind that earned presidential unit citations. But the war itself was already ending. No one on Ie Shima knew it yet. That evening the gun camera film arrived at the intelligence section. Technicians threaded the reels into projectors and watched the combat unfold again. Frame by frame. The first key, 84 exploding under Perdomo's guns. The second disintegrating in flames. The Willow trainer burning against the Korean countryside. The fourth kill, the ambusher who had become the ambushed. The fifth presented a problem. Perdomo's guns had run dry before the enemy aircraft was finally destroyed. Another Thunderbolt had delivered the killing burst. By strict rules, the credit should have gone to that pilot. But the intelligence officers looked again at the film. Without Perdomo's first attack, the Japanese fighter would have destroyed the American Thunderbolt it had been chasing. Without his pursuit, the damaged aircraft would have escaped. Without his willingness to bluff an armed opponent with empty guns, the engagement would never have happened. The decision was simple. The fifth victory would remain his. 5 confirmed kills in one day. An ace in a day. Fewer than 50 American pilots had accomplished that during the entire war. Now Oscar Perdomo joined them. But he would also become something else. The last American pilot in history to achieve it. The following morning, the 507th prepared for another mission. Pilots checked their aircraft. Crew chiefs loaded ammunition. The war continued because no one had yet told them it was over. Then the radio crackled. The message spread quickly across the airfield. Japan had surrendered. The war was finished. Oscar Perdomo would never fly another combat mission. His 5 victories on August 13, 1945 would stand forever as the final ace in a day achievement in United States military history. His award soon followed. The Distinguished Service Cross. The second highest decoration for valor the United States Army could give. The Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster. And the Presidential Unit Citation for the entire fighter group. The paperwork filled folders and archives. Official recognition of 6 violent minutes over Korea. 2 days after the surrender announcement, Perdomo witnessed something few American pilots ever saw. Japanese aircraft approaching Ie Shima. Not to attack, to surrender. White-painted Mitsubishi G-4M, Betty, bombers landed on the runway, their red rising sun insignia replaced with green crosses of truce. Japanese officers stepped out to begin the process of ending the war. Perdomo watched quietly. Just 48 hours earlier, he had been fighting men flying aircraft like those. Now they carried diplomats instead of bombs. The war had ended almost as suddenly as it had begun. Oscar Perdomo's Thunderbolt sat quietly on the airfield. Lil Me's meat chopper. The airplane named after the son he had never met. In 6 minutes of combat it had earned its name. And Oscar Perdomo had secured a place in aviation history as the last American ace in a day. For months later, the 507th Fighter Group was deactivated. The war that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally over. But for Oscar Perdomo, flying did not end when the guns fell silent. He remained in the Army Air Forces, one of the wartime pilots chosen to continue serving in the peacetime military. In 1947, the United States created a new branch of service, the United States Air Force. Perdomo transferred into the new organization along with thousands of other experienced aviators. The aircraft had already begun to change. The propeller-driven fighters that had dominated World War II were disappearing, replaced by sleek new machines powered by jet engines. Perdomo adapted quickly. Jets were faster, more demanding, but the fundamentals of flying remained the same. Stick and rudder, eyes outside the cockpit. Instincts developed through years of combat experience. In January 1950, Perdomo left active duty and returned to civilian life in Los Angeles. His son Kenneth was now 5 years old. The baby whose cartoon image had once decorated the nose of Lil Me's meat chopper was growing up. Perdomo joined the Air Force Reserve, keeping his flying qualifications while beginning life outside the military. For a brief moment, the transition seemed complete. Then history intervened. In June 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea. War returned to the Korean peninsula, the same skies where Perdomo had fought 5 years earlier. The United States mobilized rapidly. Reservists were recalled. Units were activated. A new conflict was beginning. On June 30th, 1950, Captain Oscar Perdomo reported for active duty once again. The Air Force needed experienced pilots. And the man who had become the last ace in a day over Korea was going back to war. This time the aircraft were different. Perdomo flew F-84 Thunderjets and later F-86 Sabres, jet fighters capable of speeds unimaginable during World War II. There was no nose art now. No baby with a cigar and derby hat. Kenneth was older. The war had changed. Perdomo spent much of his time flying training missions and qualifying younger pilots. He helped prepare the generation that would soon fight MiG-15s over the Yalu River. Even in peacetime training flights, danger remained constant. In February 1955, Perdomo faced one of the most dangerous moments of his entire career. He was flying a T-33 training jet with a student pilot seated behind him. Suddenly, a severe fuel leak developed. Gasoline fumes flooded the cockpit. The vapor burned his eyes and made it nearly impossible to read the instruments. Most pilots would have ejected. Saving themselves meant abandoning the aircraft. But Perdomo stayed with the plane. With the engine failing and visibility nearly gone, he executed a dead-stick landing, guiding the powerless aircraft safely back to the runway. Both he and his student survived. Another life saved by the instincts of a combat pilot. In January 1958, Oscar Perdomo retired from the Air Force. 20 years of service, 2 wars, 5 victories in a single day. A career few pilots could ever imagine. The man who had once charged enemy fighters with empty guns finally left the cockpit behind. Civilian life in Los Angeles was quieter. He had survived 2 wars. He had a family, children who knew him not as a hero from military history, but simply as their father. Years passed. The memories of war faded into stories shared at veteran gatherings. Then tragedy returned. The Vietnam War took his son. Specialist 4th Class Chris Mitchell Perdomo served as a door gunner aboard a UH-1 Huey helicopter. The same boy whose infant face had once been painted on the nose of Lil Me's meat chopper had grown into a soldier flying into combat, just as his father once had. On May 5, 1970, his helicopter crashed and exploded in South Vietnam. 3 crew members were killed. Chris Mitchell Perdomo was one of them. The loss devastated Oscar Perdomo. He had survived Japanese fighters. He had survived 8-hour missions over open ocean. He had survived 2 wars that killed millions. But he could not survive the death of his son. The man who had once faced enemy fighters with empty guns struggled with grief that no courage could overcome. Alcohol slowly consumed him. On March 2, 1976, Major Oscar Francis Perdomo died in Los Angeles. He was 56 years old. According to his wishes, his family scattered his ashes over the Pacific Ocean, the same waters he had crossed so many times during the war. The last ace in a day returned to the sky one final time. His achievement remains unique. Jet pilots have claimed 5 victories in a single day since World War II. But none have been confirmed with the certainty provided by the gun camera footage of August 13, 1945. Oscar Perdomo still stands as the last undisputed ace in a day in American history. Nearly 80 years have passed. The record still stands. It may stand forever. Today, the commemorative Air Force maintains a flying P-47 Thunderbolt painted to resemble Lil Me's meat chopper. The same baby with the cigar and derby hat still appears on the nose. The aircraft travels to air shows across the United States, telling the story of a pilot who shot down 5 enemy aircraft in 6 minutes and then charged a 6th with empty guns. Perdomo's name is carved into the memorial wall at the United States Air Force Memorial in Washington, D.C. His personal papers rest in the archives of the San Diego Air and Space Museum, and his Distinguished Service Cross citation remains preserved in official military records. August 13, 1945, 48 hours before the end of the deadliest war in human history. 38 American Thunderbolts faced more than 50 Japanese fighters over Korea. One pilot from East Los Angeles, the son of a Mexican immigrant, flying an aircraft named after his infant son, changed history in 6 minutes. 5 victories, 0 ammunition remaining, 750 miles from home. That morning the meat chopper earned its name, and Oscar Perdomo earned his place in history.